and you have a wavelet turbulence and post-processing tab. So this is cool, and we're going to get into it later, but essentially it means that we can run a simulation and we can then resize it to be like double, triple the size and add a lot more detail to it. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but essentially it means that, yeah, we can get all this extra detail. Once we run a simulation, we can add more detail to it. So either we can do one channel, all channels, whatever we want to do. The cool thing is we can exclude, like remove channels too. So once we've simulated something, we can get rid of information that we don't need anymore. So that way we can keep our file sizes small, because I'm sure a lot of people are noticing that their simulations get a few hundred gig. I was doing some today that were half a terabyte. For one shot, that was 100 frames. So that's kind of scary. Now, in addition to that, we have post-processing. There's a few things it does. One thing is it'll optimize your grid. So if it finds any excess areas that aren't being touched, then it'll resize this grid down. The way these work is that when we run these additional sims, it's like we run the initial simulation and then we're using that to then create these additional ones. So they add these little WT for wavelet turbulence or PP for post-processing. So you're never overriding a cache, which means you can roll back. So that's pretty neat to actually have. And it just means you delete the old cache if you don't need it anymore. So post-processing is cool because you can optimize your stuff down. I could also say, okay, well, I only want to use this much or whatever. I can exclude channels that I don't need. So let's say all I needed was my velocity channel. I could get rid of fire, smoke, temperature, all that stuff, and just keep my velocity. At the same time, I can retime a cache. So you need to make sure you have like velocity, temperature, all that kind of stuff exported, but I could retime a cache. So in other words, I could do a normal sim for 100 frames. This isn't the same as timescale because I don't need to simulate 1,000 frames. I can literally simulate 100, find the area that I really like, and then retime it. So I've been using this in a lot of productions to get a lot of large-scale, slow-motion sims, where I'll simulate 100 frames and I'll make 1,000 frames out of one chunk. So it's pretty cool to use. And so the output is the PP down here. And also, I've been able to get my Fume caches down to 1% of their original size using a lot of these tools as well. So it's pretty cool. So lots of new stuff there, and the way you access it usually is you do your normal sim and then you switch to wavelet and you do that sim and then you switch your cache to the wavelet cache you just wrote, and I could jump into post-processing, run the sim, and then I can switch to the post-processing. So I can cycle through the different caches that I have right here. Other cool stuff, let's just jump through this real quick. This is all pretty much the same kind of thing. Same with object source and illumination. Rendering is the same too, but the main thing that we have is under simulation. 2.1 is where we got a lot of new stuff in here. So we'll go through CFL conditions and a lot of the stuff and explain it a lot more thoroughly. One thing though which is a big difference is rather than using substeps, we actually now instead, basically these things all are based on each other, so they work together. Like instead of subframes, like if I wanted to simulate something, like let's say I had an object move through my fluid in one area just a little too quickly, rather than having to simulate subframes and have to simulate for 5 times the amount of time, what I can do is use the CFL condition, which essentially it'll tell me, it'll say, okay, well, if an area moves further than, like if a voxel moves further than 5 voxels per frame, or whatever we set here, then it'll implement subframe sampling for that amount of time. So I can set the amount of subframes I want to do, so I can cap it essentially to 1 or whatever I want to have. And then it'll dynamically begin to subframe sample where it needs to, and then the rest of the time it'll sim at a normal pace. So if it's smooth for most of it, then there's a few frames something moves through it, it will subframe sample for all those frames. Another cool thing is the variable density. We'll get into that again later on, but basically now down here we can control the temperature buoyancy or the fuel buoyancy or smoke buoyancy here, and what I can do is have variable density solver, and essentially it means that that all the fluids from different emitters can have different set densities. So if I want to have like a really thin smoke and I had like a really thick smoke, it could move through it and affect it, and also all the thinner bits on it will be affected as well. Essentially, you know, they'll all be able to read off of a density, but rather like the way that it works though is if I enable this, it then will look at either the density, like the amount of smoke that I'm emitting as the density, or I can use the turbulence as a density as well. So these things will affect how much they react either to the smoke's density or to heat as well. So it just means that I can apply these different float values to be multiplied and affected by enabling this. We also have a new advection stride. The new solver essentially is just a bit more efficient with allowing fluids not to dissipate as quickly. So there's different types in here, either to just affect the fields or to affect the velocity channel 2, or you can go with the default one. Other than that, now we have offset in here, which means we just offset our phasing, which is kind of handy for just getting different effects if we want to get a different turbulent effect to kind of break things up. And those are pretty much the key things here. If I scroll down to fire creates smoke, we now have a temperature base, so we could say only the fire that's this hot, and it just means that if I only want like the tips of my fire to create smoke, I can, or whatever, rather than creating from everywhere. So it's just again getting additional controls out of this. So we also have the volume density multiplier here. If I enable the variable density, then that's enabled here, so I can have my volume density multiplier, so that way I can multiply the thickness of something in terms of how it'll physically affect everything, or I can turn that, or keep that off, or the 1, and that means it'll be based on the smoke buoyancy. So there's a few options in there for how to affect the density, and that's pretty much it. Also fluid mapping. Personally, I don't think I'll ever use fluid mapping again at this point, just because wavelet turbulence is the bomb. So I use wavelet turbulence for everything, or at least for most things, but I don't use fluid mapping anymore, because if I want to get detail, I'd rather get physical detail rather than like the texture, which always looked kind of streaky. So those are the key things. Yeah, ultimately those are like a lot of the key features that we'll be covering, and we'll be covering everything. This is going to be pretty cool. This isn't Fume Effects Essentials, and this isn't Fume Effects Advanced. This is an entirely new DVD that is more something that you should have just in general. It's going to cover a lot of cool stuff, but it's more going to look at explaining it all really thoroughly. And I've already recorded all the thorough stuff, and I've given that to a lot of more industry veterans from a lot of bigger studios to kind of look over and get a lot of insights. I've been really testing this out with a lot of really big shot people who do a lot of effects, both people who are new to Fume Effects, guys who work at ILM and Rhythm Hughes, a lot of the bigger studios who aren't used to using Fume Effects. They use their own tools, just to see how this compares. And also a lot of people who are very thorough with Fume Effects, and kind of all the big wig names in the industry. So this has been something I'll be able to kind of really go back and forth and get a lot of time to kind of polish. So I've been working on this for now about 7 months, I think, on and off. So it's been pretty thorough, spending time really refining this and going back and making sure it's really everything it can be. So I've re-recorded it quite a few times and rebuilt a lot of different bits of it, but just to make sure it really covers a lot of the core aspects really thoroughly, and also that I haven't really missed anything, and that everything is really explained in a core way, and also shown, how we can use it to take advantage of it in production. So this should be, well, this is going to be really fun, and it's essentially something that will complement everything else. If you have done a lot of the previous training material, this will kind of show you how to bridge that over to Fume FX 2. And at the same time, any additional future training material, such as a lot of the advanced workshops that I'm running, this stuff here is more advanced, but it's more a technical yet really well described way of looking at all Fume FX features. So I'm looking forward to seeing what we can get into, and I just want to give like a brief overview of what all these features do, and now I can jump in and start to really show off a lot of things in a lot more of a thorough, more different passage. Alright, so let's get started.